In the sumptuous office of Thomas Morrison, a 35-year-old billionaire, a contract awaiting signature gleamed under the dim light. This document symbolized the final step to seal an international alliance promising to multiply his fortune. But as he was about to sign, a trembling but urgent voice broke the silence, like a cry from the depths of the soul. "Don't sign, it's a trap." All eyes turned to the young woman who stood at the entrance to the room. She was dirty, disheveled, her face gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. She bore the scars of a life on the streets, a homeless person who nevertheless seemed to hold a truth that no one in the room understood. Emma, her name, barely spoken in the tumult of the room, was the last person one would have imagined in such a place. Thomas, although surprised, felt something that he could not ignore. A strange shiver ran through his body. Who was she to question such a contract? And why did she seem so determined to warn him? The billionaire, used to being surrounded by experts and advisors, did not know what to think of this appearance. He looked into her face marked by suffering, but in her eyes there was something indescribable, a certainty, an urgency. The members of his team, who stood around the large, solid oak table, exchanged perplexed glances. One of them, a renowned lawyer, spoke in a cold and authoritative voice. "Madam, you are in the wrong room. This contract has been carefully drawn up by the best legal experts. It is perfectly secure." But Emma, her eyes filled with sincere despair, took a step forward. "I don't have much time," she whispered in a shaky but firm voice. "If you sign, you will lose everything. Not just your money, but everything. You will be destroyed." She paused, as if her words were too heavy to bear. "What you see here is just a facade. Behind it all, there are forces that you cannot understand. Forces far more powerful than money or politics." The contract now seemed to take away all the luxurious ambience of the office. The marble walls, the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city's glittering towers, and the carefully selected art objects, all of it faded into the shadow of palpable urgency. Emma's warning resonated like an uncomfortable echo in people's minds, disrupting the imposed order of this meeting. Lawyers and investors, seated around the solid oak table, whispered among themselves, their murmurs reflecting as much bewilderment as annoyance. Some exchanged skeptical glances, others tried to capture Thomas's attention, hoping to bring him back to reality. But Thomas, motionless, seemed elsewhere. His gaze, unable to turn away from Emma, betrayed a mixture of disbelief and confusion. This woman, homeless and in bad shape, dared to challenge the system he had worked so hard to build. The contract before him represented months of negotiations and an incredible opportunity. Yet Emma's words, imbued with a disconcerting certainty, were beginning to crack his confidence. "Who are you?" he finally asked, breaking the silence with his hesitant, almost fragile voice. This simple questioning betrayed the beginnings of doubt, a tiny but real opening. "What matters," she replied, looking him straight in the eye, "is what you're about to do." His voice, although trembling, carried a gravity that seemed to transcend appearances. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the men in suits around the table. She looked at them one by one, her dark eyes seeming to pierce their masks of professionalism. Her gaze had something disturbing, almost accusatory, as if she saw beyond the impeccable facades. "Don't sign," she insisted more urgently. "It's a trap. They will destroy you." A sharp knock sounded on the door, breaking the tension that was thickening in the room. Two security guards entered, their crisp uniforms and piercing gazes adding a new dose of gravity to the scene. Their presence imposed a certain authority, but Emma, far from backing down, raised her head, anchoring her bare feet on the cold marble floor. She seemed challenged on all sides, but her determination remained intact. She was not there for herself, but to warn, to save. One of Thomas's lawyers, Jeremy, a man with a clenched jaw and a scathing voice, stood up. "Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, this interruption has gone on long enough. This woman has no business here. Allow security to evacuate her immediately." But before he could finish his sentence, Emma's voice rose, shaky but powerful, sweeping away his authority. "It's not just about the money," she insisted, her gaze burning with sincerity. "You lose everything. You will be stripped, your empire collapsed." His words struck like thunder, shaking the well-rooted certainties of the assembly. Thomas, frozen, felt a shiver run down his spine. These words, as absurd as they seemed, triggered a flash of doubt in his mind. How could she know that? Who was she really to say such things? What if there was some truth to his warnings? Abruptly, he stood up, slightly overturning his chair. A shocked silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to him as he grabbed the contract in front of him. His hands shook slightly as he began to reread the little lines, the ones he had once deemed secondary, unimportant. His eyes scanned the pages with frantic urgency, and his breath hitched when he came across what he was looking for. The clauses. Transfer of assets. Decision-making power ceded. A termination clause hidden in technical language, but which, on closer inspection, completely unbalanced the terms of the agreement. Everything would swing in favor of the other party. This contract was not a triumph, but a cleverly concealed trap. Emma hadn't lied. Just as he began to understand the magnitude of what he had almost signed, a calm but icy voice interrupted his thoughts. "Don't listen to him." Thomas looked up to meet the piercing gaze of Victor Reynolds, his trusted advisor, a man who had accompanied him in his greatest successes. Victor advanced slowly, his steps calculated, his face frozen in an expression of cold mastery. "This woman is crazy," he said, his voice sharp, tinged with unwavering confidence. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. This contract has been verified and validated by our best experts. Don't let an unknown person sabotage your future." A heavy silence followed his words. Thomas looked at Victor, then at Emma, doubt growing in his mind. The room, so luxurious and familiar, suddenly seemed foreign to him, like a theater where a play was being performed whose real stakes he was still unaware of. Emma, without looking away, whispered in a voice almost inaudible but full of determination, "What if it was him, your real trap?" But Emma's words hit Thomas harder than anything. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the truth slowly crept into his mind. She had seen what he had not seen. She had heard whispers in the shadows, secrets he did not know, and she had uncovered the betrayal that was woven around him. Victor, his trusted advisor, the man to whom he had entrusted his destiny, was behind it all. He had orchestrated every move, every decision, every alliance in the shadows, to take total control of his empire. He had manipulated him, led him by the hand towards this fatal signature. This contract was not a triumph, but a cage carefully constructed to imprison him. The impact of this revelation was deafening. Thomas felt a dull rage awaken within him, but also a bitter relief. The truth, although atrocious, finally allowed him to see clearly. The man he had placed absolute trust in was the traitor he never wanted to recognize. He looked at the contract, this document that was supposed to be the key to his future, and in a desperate gesture, he grabbed it and brutally tore it up before his eyes. The sound of tearing echoed through the room like an echo of rebellion, a silent but unmistakable declaration. He had just broken the chains that people had tried to impose on him. But Victor, far from being destabilized, took a step forward, his face disfigured by anger. His gaze, black and piercing, was filled with the rage of a man who felt betrayed. "You are mistaken, Thomas," he said in an icy voice. "You have no idea what's at stake here." He waved his hand, and the men in suits around the table moved closer, ready to intervene. The tension in the air was palpable, like a rope ready to snap. But Thomas did not give in. He stood there, his fists clenched, ready to face the enemy he had unknowingly nurtured. "Did you think I would never find out the truth?" Her voice shook with rage, but she was firm. "I see clearly now, Victor. And it's too late to go back." Before Victor could respond, a siren sound rang out in the distance, growing rapidly. Police sirens. The alarm, the alert. Thomas turned his gaze towards a window. The flashing lights were approaching, and he knew instinctively that this alarm was not for nothing. The time of choice had arrived. He couldn't go back any longer. The world he had built was on the verge of collapse, swept away in a whirlwind he could not stop. Tension was at its peak, and the smell of betrayal filled the air. Everything he had known, everything he had thought solid, seemed to dissolve in the storm he had unwittingly unleashed. Victor turned to the men around him, their faces masked with a worry that no longer seemed to hide much. They knew the game was over, but no one wanted to admit it. Victor's men exchanged furtive glances, assessing the situation. And deep in his eyes, Thomas saw a glimmer of despair. What he had just done was only the first step in a battle that would turn his life upside down. He turned to Emma one last time. She, who had been a simple stranger, but who now carried the truth on her shoulders. She had opened his eyes, and for that, he could never thank her enough. He knew he no longer had a choice. He was no longer the same man he had been when he entered that office. The sirens were now almost at their doorstep. The hour of choice was not just a moral dilemma, but a question of survival. The police weren't the only approaching threat. On the horizon, an entire empire would fall apart under the weight of lies and secrets. The real confrontation had only just begun. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his last strength. When he opened them, he knew what he had to do.